Yeah, go on.
Well, I mean, this is easily probably his most controversial essay. If people read this,
Probably. Yeah. Especially now,
right?
right? Because again, this was published in 2004.
Yeah. Well, and again, this is just the beginning of that, and now the social media has
Mm-hmm.
broadened it. Like literally, it's the obsession. It's literally all that's allowed is, contemporary identity politics. But on page 160, I think he starts off giving like this little like anecdote about teaching his students this Langston Hughes poem,
Yeah,
and
and I think it's worth saying, the poem is Island, or the first part of Island, I guess, by Langston Hughes.
but he goes on to say that like his students were struggling or they were talking about it, right? But then he says once the particulars of the poet's identity were known to them, the
Mm-hmm.
students clung to those interpretations that relied entirely on those particulars, and the possibility that Hughes's poem might be one in a broad tradition of poems in English addressing the human condition was abandoned for the certainty that the poem spoke primarily for two facets of that many-faceted tradition: gays and African Americans. Rather than enriching the possibilities for meaning, these aspects of identity had prompted readers to impose on Hughes's poem what it might be radical to suggest is segregation, however inadvertent, but I'll suggest it.
How about that?
Well, I mean, I think it's correct. I think it's
Yeah.
entirely correct for
I
what we're
mean,
dealing
I
with.
think
I think
I
it's
think it's
gotten
funny
more
that he
correct.
experiments with this in his
Yeah.
class. I think it's funny that he'll give his class, he'll have them read a poem that has no author name attached to it, have them do the interpretation, and then tell them who it is. And then they have this crazy reinterpretation of it. And I think that's great. Like, I think that's a really good way to teach this lesson to students. It's also like exactly the opposite of everything that I was taught as an MFA student, which I also like took issue with, as you know.
Well, and I think it's even more true now than it was in 2004 when he was publishing this. I mean, it's literally this obsession with author biography. Like, we are not allowed to interpret anything else. Like, that's literally like a rule that is reinforced by staff, by peers in the class, by everything. You're not allowed to have conversations about poetry, particularly if it's a black poet, right? If you like, you literally, it takes over everything. So he says, and he said this
Yeah,
is
it's not even
radical,
that you're
right?
not allowed. It's that like it ends
It
up being the only lens through which you
right.
are reading the poem, and then you do the poet a disservice by not acknowledging that they are partaking in this long tradition, which is what Phillips is saying here.
Well, as he said, it might be radical to suggest it, but he calls it literally segregating off Hughes is like in the larger scheme of American literature, because we're so obsessed with this one thing, and it's blinding us to the larger greatness of Hughes' work, like of Hughes, what he means to not just the American canon, but
As though
like
he's a black
literature.
poet, therefore he is like somehow distinct from
Right. That's what he means.
this
So it's
larger
literally,
canon.
yeah, it's literally like othering it, like like kind of doing the opposite of what the intention was, I think. But yeah, I think he's correct about this. I think not enough people say it, and I wish Phillips would say it more, because it really is hurting poetry right now. I mean, everybody knows it. We're just, you're not allowed to say it. But you could in 2004, which I think is interesting. And even that he goes on page 161. In an age in which author photographs and the author's private life get as much play as the author's writing, it becomes increasingly more difficult to come upon a poem without bringing to our assessment of it what we know of the author's identity. But ultimately, it should be the identity of the poem, not the poet, that matters. The poem's identity, its virtues or lack of them, must be the focus of our critical scrutiny. When this isn't the case, then the issue of identity only complicates and muddies clear and fair judgment on the part of the reader. Often, too, the poet's judgment becomes muddied. This is why it is difficult to defend as good poetry the bulk of the poems produced by the Black Arts movement of the 1960s and 70s. It rarely transcends its time and history or the individuality of the poet, and I am suggesting that good poetry must do at least these two things.
Yeah. I think this is actually great. I mean,